Dani Kahil, and he's going to talk to you today about envisioning beautiful solutions on Power Platform and Dynamics 365. So over to you, Dani.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you very much for helping me and supporting me in that presentation. So thank you all for joining today, spending the time with us. So my name is Dani Kahil. I work as a business application practice lead for a company called Empired in Australia, in Brisbane. So mostly what I'm doing is delivering Dynamics 365 and Power Platform projects for our clients here in Australia, and specifically in Brisbane. The objective really of the session is to kind of give you an understanding and help you transition your career to Dynamics 365 or the Power Platform. I want to kind of also help you understand that Dynamics 365 is not only a technical career. Essentially, the session I'm covering would be very suited for a business analyst or a consultant with business consultancy skills, right? So it is not only a technical career. If you are in those two topics, you fit very well into the topic I'm describing today, which is envisioning and kind of getting to a shared understanding of what we're going to implement in Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform. I'll cover that a bit more in detail, and also getting you excited about that career change if that's what you're looking for. So the agenda today, what is envisioning? What does that mean in Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform? So I'll describe that a bit better. That's part of the agenda. I'll also run through an envisioning journey that I'm kind of putting together over the experiences that I have. I have a process for envisioning solutions, so it's my ideas, and I'm kind of tweaking it along the way. So I'll be sharing some of those experiences about the process and some of the specific techniques to help envision solutions. Like the shadowing user, like my take on the requirements validation workshops, the requirement validation sessions. I'll be covering as well about my go-to diagrams. And I will also describe, so I have a couple of diagrams that I use to kind of help clients envision solutions, but I will also cover about one of the diagrams that I use most of the time, which is the conceptual diagram. Okay, so envisioning solutions, right? So what does that mean, envisioning in Dynamics, but in general, right? It's essentially to imagine the future and imagine as some future possibilities and visualize something. Now, in Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform, how do you accomplish that at the beginning of your project? That's a bit of a challenge that I've seen especially clients struggling with. So essentially, how can you, at the beginning of a project with your clients, imagine a future solution for them? And it's quite an important point, right? Because you want to end up at the end of the project having met the expectations of your clients. So at the beginning, it's almost like helping them envision and having a shared understanding of what is that vision that you're going to build together using Dynamics 365 or the Power Platform. It's also about making sure that we all, we all part of the project have the same understanding of the requirements, right? The same understanding of the client, of what the clients needs to kind of accomplish within the platform. I have a passion about that subject, or I'm kind of researching and trying to improve that envisioning throughout the project, that envisioning process, and it's kind of happened throughout the years where Over my career, I implemented a couple of Dynamics 365 projects. I also ended up landing on some of the projects just in the middle or at the end, and then often I was kind of asked to fix something that a previous consultant did, or that a previous company did, or even that a client tried to do and then kind of failed a little bit. And what I found is that a lot of time it was not really a technical issues that landed that kind of made that project to be less successful. It was not really about the technical technical features that was bad implemented or something. Most of the time, from what I have seen, it was about I had the feeling that looking back at what was the original requirement, is that essentially the consultant or everyone on the project didn't really understand or didn't really had a shared understanding of what they wanted to accomplish together. So it kind of struck me, right? I'm jumping into a project and then the client is complaining, oh, this is not working how it's supposed to be. And then I look back at the requirement that were at the beginning or presented to that consultant or that previous partner that was involved. And then it's not surprising me that is working the way it's working. It's because there were some holes in the requirements, or there were no clear vision about what that system or what that feature had to do, right? Somebody just wrote something. There is kind of a bit of ambiguity around that feature, and we land and it landed where it is, right? With holes in that solution. So it kind of struck me that it is very important, or I felt that it's very important that from the beginning of the project, you help your client or you help the whole team having a shared understanding of what is required to be built, but also guiding your user and guiding your client through an envisioning process. So all the time sharing and envisioning and kind of prototyping along that journey, so that you kind of bring your client along, and at the end of the project there is no miss requirements, but there is also the expectations are actually met at the end of the project, because along the way you had the time to kind of bring and understand the vision that the clients want to have, but you also kind of shared your experience implementing Dynamics with your clients to make sure that we all as a team kind of reach that vision. So look, it's not a perfect, of course, process, as I said, right? That envisioning journey throughout your project, your Dynamics 365 or Power Platform project is, and what I had here as a draft kind of process that I will share with you, it's still in progress, and it will be in progress, I guess, throughout my career, where after each project, after each envisioning project, I'll kind of fine tune that process, right? So what I wanted to share with you today is, if you look at a typical implementation of Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform, you essentially mostly before the project, so if I start here, before the project starts, you essentially start with a couple of key milestones, right? Essentially, before the project even starts, there is often a business plan that the company needs to meet, right? So that business plan, it's kind of part of understanding and envisioning your solution, because you need, as a consultant or as a company implementing Dynamics 365 for your clients, you need to understand what is the business plan that your company needs to meet, and what are the current challenges that are going to address, or that are currently facing and preventing that business plan to come into realization. So it's very important that you ask your client before even starting that envisioning, to ask those two key steps or key artifacts, right? The business plan needs to be understood, and the current challenges as well. Then the third point, most of the time, what the company normally does once they identify the challenges, is they're looking for solutions. And some solutions are technical, others not. If it's a technical solution, then sometimes Dynamics is part of that mix. So one of the solutions could be Dynamics 365 for customer service. It's a solution because we currently, for example, have challenges with our customer service team, right? We're losing some customers because they are unhappy and so forth. And then we looked at solution, and one of the solutions is bringing to the company a robust customer service platform. And Dynamics 365 has one of those available within the suite. So that's where kind of your client or your company want to go for. So that's kind of before the project that starts. Most of the time the company has that idea and knows that they need, for example, a customer service application. Now, so after those three steps here, most of the time as well, your company will build a list of requirements that we call product backlog, right? So that list of requirements is then provided to a vendor or provided to a consultant so that they can kind of understand and provide most of the time a quoting or a quote with a plan and so the planning scope and a cost on how much is going to cost to implement those requirements. And this is where the challenge starts, I think, in my opinion, where the start of the envisioning should start at this point, right? So essentially, and this is where the process that I kind of have mapped out starts, and I'll go a little bit more in details in a few slides, but essentially the start of the envisioning starts here, and then you go into project delivery. So I don't want to spend too much time into this piece of the project delivery. There's plenty of materials available in Agile. So I'm here describing an Agile process. There's plenty of courses, and Neil Benson, who presented this morning, for instance, had a very good course on how to implement Dynamics 365 using Scrum. And essentially it's following and describing in details that process where you have your project iteration, your iteration planning. So an iteration is a couple of weeks worth of work that you plan, and then for that iteration that you plan and for the requirements that's going to deliver during that iteration, you do some analysis and design, you do some build, you do some testing, you deploy. So you do some testing, you deploy to test in different environments, and then you also do some iteration review. So basically, you review how that sprint went, right? So the focus really of my presentation is around the envisioning. So this piece of work here, the start of the envisioning. So essentially, before starting the project, most of the time, what we have identified is that based only on the product backlog, it's very difficult to provide kind of an accurate planning, scoping, and cost. There is a little bit more into it, right? And some clients or some customers are doing this themselves or kind of something similar in that position. Then they are a little bit more advanced in a way, and you can, if they provide you with the artifact, that I will describe a bit later as well. If they provide you with, the goals of the platform, if the requirements are nicely articulated, if there is a lot of visuals to help you understand what are those requirements, then essentially you're pretty far ready. But a lot of time there is nothing. There's just a list or a document of requirement. The system must do this, the system must do that, right? Which is sometimes a little bit tricky to kind of understand and plan without really going through an initial envisioning exercise that I described here, right? And look, what I also found is during that process, I kind of start learning design thinking, and that process is really inspired by the design thinking and the values of design thinking, right? So if you don't know what is design thinking, take a look. There's a lot of documentation as well available, but essentially design thinking comes with a couple of steps where you first want to empathize, research about your user's needs, right? So what exactly do your user need? What is essential for them? So you want to empathize with your users, right? Then after you have this, you're going to define, so state the user needs and the problem. You're going to define exactly what they need and what problem they need to be resolved for them. Then the next one is ideation. So essentially, you want to challenge some assumptions, challenge some ideas, help them create some ideas. And I'm talking here really within Dynamics 365 and Power Platform project. I'm actually using that process here during my during our envisioning project, right? To really kind of, and in the next slides, I'll go a little bit more details into what are the specific actions or steps I'm doing in each of those. After the IDA, there is a prototype. So most of the time we also prototype using Dynamics 365 directly. There is a nice now form and UI builder where you can prototype very nicely with your users. You can prototype the forms and the views. I'm also using some external tools to prototype some screen layouts, for example, and show that to the client even before building it. And then you can test your thinking using proof of concept. So spin, I will try to use a bit some terms that are a bit less maybe technical for the audience. So you start, for example, you subscribe for a new trial, and then on using that trial of Dynamics 365 or the Power Platform, you can kind of experience and experiment things, right? And then what you want to do, you show that to your users, and they provide you live feedback on your ideas. So that's really the process. The last one as well is throughout the project. So this is essentially most of the time at the beginning of the project, especially when there is no vision for what the clients wants to implement, and there is still kind of holes in the requirements. Then you want to make sure that you run that envisioning exercise. But during the project as well, as the project goes on, you want to make sure that you fine-tune that envisioning. So after, in each sprint iteration or in each sprint of your project, you kind of fine-tune that vision of your system, right? You make tweaks to that. You make tweaks to some of the diagrams you have, and kind of you update your documentation and to make sure that all your stakeholders. Again, that everyone has the same understanding of requirements, but also of the vision. As I said, I'll cover a little bit more about the process of the envisioning itself, right? So usually most of the time when you want to start an envisioning, and I'm using this process as well during the project implementation to kind of fine-tune that envisioning, but essentially you start probably with a kickoff meeting. What you do then, and it's quite important, is that you identify the use cases and the personas, right? I use those two because use cases will help you identify which users will be using the system. Persona will kind of also gives you a bit of for each of the users, what are their goals, what are their pains, what are their frustrations. It's kind of trying to identify the users of your system. The next thing that is very valuable to do is you want to organize some user shadowing sessions, right? So this is where we talk about the empathize phase, where you sit down with some of the users that you identified here. And before you sit down, you try to review some of the documentation provided by the client, but then here you essentially sit down with some of your users and see how they go and how they do the job they do, because essentially you're going to implement a system for them, right? So you want to see and feel their pains. I'll cover, so one of the slides later on, I'll go deeper into what is a shadowing session, right? And my tips to run and why it's so important to run shadowing sessions. But especially here, you want to run those. Then essentially, that is probably something, if you're a functional consultant or a business consultant, that is something probably quite familiar to you. You want to run some requirements gathering workshops are gathered to kind of, so before requirements validation workshops here, you probably had some requirements gathering workshops before to kind of populate that backlog. But now that we know what system we're going to implement, which is Dynamics 365 or the Power Platform, you want to make sure that all the requirements listed here fit nicely, can be validated against Dynamics 365 or the Power Platform, right? So from a typical example, a user wants to do a specific feature, but then he describes how that feature needs to work. Maybe that feature in Dynamics 365 or the Power Platform doesn't exactly meet 100% the requirement, but then during that requirement validation session, you present a couple of things. You present especially the demo here of Dynamics, and you kind of try to fit that requirement within Dynamics 365 so that you tweak slightly the tool, you tweak slightly Dynamics 365 so that you don't overcomplicate the system. So essentially, you translate that requirement here, you translate it to a Dynamics 365 or Power Platform project. You translate that using, for example, the demo of Dynamics, and you can show screens in Dynamics and say, look, you want to do this and that. This is how I think we can do it in Dynamics, right? So during requirements validation workshops, essentially, I use most of the time some demoing of screens. I start building what I call a conceptual diagrams, and I'll cover. I have a slide and we need to go a bit deeper about what are conceptual diagrams for me. But here, essentially, conceptual diagrams are the building blocks that what you're going to build, right? So when a client wants a customer service system, what are kind of the items and the building blocks of that conceptual of that system? And I described it using a tool called a conceptual diagram, and I'll cover that a bit further down. We also want to make sure that for each of the requirements validation workshops, I start with the key success factors just to make sure that they are understood by everyone. And if they are not defined, the very first thing I ask my clients, or I ask the project team to come up with, is the key success factors for a project, which are kind of the rail guards for your project, right? What are the 4 or 5 key features that we need to deliver at the end of that project, right? For a customer service application, it could be provide a system where all cases are visible, all cases for clients are visible within one system. That could be one key success factor, right? So very important to define those. If you don't define those, then during the project, your requirements that may be conflicting, or 2 users pushing for 2 different requirements might actually cause you some issues. If you have those defined, then you can very quickly look at those key success factors and kind of check if the specific requirements for some of your users fit within those key success factors. Then what we also do is prototyping. So a lot of prototyping using a Dynamics 365 test environment or a sandbox environment. I also use external tools like diagramming tools like Draw, just to picture some fields, change labels, move things around, and essentially show that to the client as well, so that they can provide feedbacks, right? And then, as I said, you start from a demo. Those are the first sessions you have, probably using a simple kind of vanilla a demo from a sandbox. And then as you go through that process, you can kind of build a proof of concept here, right? Where, again, that's a real sandbox where you adapt fields, forms, and so forth, so that you can get feedback from what the client actually is telling you during the workshops. And I repeat that process, or we repeat that process here as long as we have those workshops. So for after each workshop, we ideate, we prototype, we test in a proof of concept, and we go back to the next workshops. And again, the length of that exercise really varies from project to project. If it's very simple, it can take a couple of days. If it's a bit more complex, it takes weeks, because you want to go through each of the main features of your project to make sure that everyone has the same understanding of the requirements and same understanding of the vision, right, of the project. Then at the end, you have envisioning delivery, presentation, where you present all your artifacts. I wanted kind of to share with you what I feel having a project without an envisioning, from which is kind of the worst kind of spectrum, to the Z, where you have a project with an envisioning defined, and most of the time projects are somewhere within that spectrum. The best scenarios, they start, your client is pretty ready and they have their vision, they have clearly defined requirements, they have clearly defined goals, and then essentially that envisioning, it can be the project. You can almost start the project straight away and you kind of fine-tune that envisioning down the track. If you have clients where this is not defined, or if your project where this is not defined at all, then you will probably feel like at point A, right? So you're not sure, if you jump on a project where there is no vision almost, then you kind of feel lost and you don't really know where to start. So at this point, having an envisioning project will clearly bring you back as quickly as possible, will try to bring you back to the green zone, where you will feel kind of, you understand the big picture of where you want to be. But essentially, if this is the situation of your project at the beginning, where you don't know where to do, where to start, then essentially probably there is no clear vision for the project, so an envisioning exercise would be recommended, right? So without the envisioning, you probably have unclear, ambiguous, conflicting requirements. You don't really understand what the requirement means. Two requirements are conflicting to each other when you review the list. And again, maybe there is no clear goal for the platform that you're going to implement. And this is how you feel when you kind of run your first envisioning exercise, or this is how you feel as well when essentially either the clients are somewhere here already, and then during the project you run those envisioning kind of workshops and those envisioning artifacts, where you understand the big picture, or everyone understands the big picture, everyone feels confident about having a shared understanding of what we need, and then there is clear goals for the platform. A couple of tips on shadowing users. So as I said, right here in that diagram, the user shadowing sessions are very important in my opinion, right? So a couple of tips on how to do them and how they run, right? So if we start with why doing them, and you understand here why is it so important, right, to run those shadowing sessions. Look, in my opinion, right, so user most of the time will forget to mention things during workshops or interviews, right? So they will not remember about everything. If they sit down and show you how they do things, they will kind of, oh, actually that's the exceptions I forgot to mention, or and then they can kind of explain while they do their stuff, right? So it will kind of add way more details to and make you understand way better how they work. You will understand how they interact with the systems, with any other systems, right? Maybe they interact with 3 or 4 different systems, right? So you want to see that. You want to having them explain that it's sometimes difficult. If you see how they do that, that will give you a lot of understanding and empathy. You want to measure the interruptions, right? So a typical scenario here, we implemented, so a requirements was for a customer service, agent to take calls. So our first ideas was, we implement something simple in Dynamics with a nice process and so forth. When we sat down with the users, we kind of saw that their work was so almost chaotic, where they had to take phone calls, they had to reply, they had to reply to many other inquiries coming from people coming to the desk. They had plenty of sessions open and so on. It clearly kind of showed us that, well, if we go the way we thought, then that will not really solve their problem. We kind of had to tweak dynamics in a way to kind of fit a couple of more scenarios within that that requirement. And then, as well, as you see user showing you things, you will yourself maybe find other opportunities for improvements. Maybe some other features in Dynamics are well suited for some of the pains that the user is experiencing, and those are not even listed as a requirement, right? So it will give you opportunities to fine tune that. When to run those? So as I said, before you start your project, so during the envisioning, definitely before. I mean, before, kind of in between your project, but then also it's kind of useful when you have a running system, or you have Dynamics 365 running for a couple of months, couple of years, and you want to put some enhancements, you can sit down with users and see how they use Dynamics now, and make sure and kind of help them or tweak some of those stuff, some of those features to make them even more productive using the system. How to run it? So before the session, so essentially understanding the roles and the users. So that's why I showed you before that I use a use case or a persona diagram to kind of identify those users and roles. And then sometimes you kind of you want to determine the processes you want to see the users do, right? So there is maybe sometimes a very specific process that the user do. So ask the user to show you that process. During the session, if possible, we sometimes record the sessions, or at least we take pictures, right? Take pictures, and then kind of can go back to those when we kind of model dynamics to kind of, tweak it to look or to adapt dynamics to kind of fit their needs. Some users will be a bit, uncomfortable. So let them know that they are in control of the session and they can stop anytime, right? After the session, share your notes and share your recommendation. And then there is types of observation, maybe something quickly to add, that you have your active observation, where you actively sit next to the user and you actively ask questions to try to understand the process. But there is also a passive way of doing things, where you just let the user do his own thing and you just sit and just take some notes. So that's about the shadowing session that we do on Dynamics 365 and Power Platform sessions. I covered as well requirements validation sessions previously, right, as part of that envisioning journey, very similar to the requirements validation session, requirement gathering sessions that you have in during your projects, right? Where so here it's really articulating around making sure, so if I go with why using it, making sure that you go really through the initial requirements that the clients give you, and you pick those inconsistencies, right? You also want to make sure to kind of understand some complexity, and by showing them dynamics, or showing them how that could fit within dynamics, you will quickly get a feeling from the users whether that's complex, or whether, they are pretty open to go with a standard screen in dynamics, for instance. You want to try to simplify complex requirements by proposing alternative solutions. So maybe a requirement from the client is very complicated, or because you know dynamics already a bit, this will be tricky to implement. You want to try to kind of persuade the client or your customer to go and do it in a simpler way, because essentially if you do it simpler, it's cleaner, it's easier to maintain. It's kind of it's easy to update later on, and so forth. And it will also help you reevaluate some priorities of requirements, right? So that's very important. Why? I'll go quickly through the planning. This is simple, kind of standard workshop phases, kind of, it's the phases of a typical workshop, whether you run those workshops on any other kind of project, it's fairly similar, right? Where you have a planning of your workshop, you just want to make sure that you define the purpose, the attendees, you prepare your questions, you have your slide deck, and so forth. Important, what I always do during the execution is just reminding the client that you are here to help them. And I often ask whether I can challenge some requirements, because just not to offend anyone, right? Because sometimes users or clients spend time or documenting those requirements, and so I just want to ask first to say, look, can I really ask the question, the why? Can I challenge some of the requirements to kind of see whether they are really important or not? So you want to kind of ask that permission to kind of, before destroying almost some of those. So that's, I would recommend definitely to use. And this is a very important one, right? Using a lot of visuals, right, to foster a shared understanding of requirements throughout the stakeholders. And some of the diagrams I'll cover in a couple of minutes will show you some of the very visual diagrams that I use next to that, to showing them Dynamics 365 and the forms and the views, showing them a lot of nice diagrams to kind of, help them envision what that system will.
I'm pretty sure I can't hear you right now, Dani. Oh, you're back.
Okay.
Sorry, we just missed about 20-30 seconds, so just jump back.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. So I'll get back to this one, I guess, right? The execution, or even before?
No, we didn't lose you for long. Don't worry. Just carry on from where feels right.
Thank you. Right. When using it, right? So again, when using those requirement validation session, essentially during that scoping before the project starts, but also you can definitely use them when you run your project to kind of fine tune and analyze how things should be built in Dynamics. So definitely worthwhile using them there. Typical agenda. So define the purpose, key success factors. As I said before, always bring the key success factors as part of the agenda to make sure they are understood for everyone. What is in it for the audience? Always share that, and educate. Always, what I do is all during those workshops, I always try to educate users on Dynamics 365 and the Power Platform. And as I said, show a lot of diagrams, right? So I always show a conceptual diagram, which is kind of the building blocks of the solution you are building, showing that to the client so that they can kind of tweak it along the way with you. And then, of course, you run your workshop to kind of get details about the requirements of or the subject you are discussing. Some of my go-to diagrams. So as I said, that use case diagram that I use quite a lot because it will help me identify quickly the users of the system. So I have the client, I have the customer service agent, maybe I have the customer service manager. I can quickly identify here what are the actions or the use cases of that user, which will help me or help. This is typical kind of old school business analysis almost, where from those use cases, sorry, I have my dog getting crazy here, but yeah, presenting at home. So those are the alias of such a presentations. So yeah,
Don't worry at all. We're all human and we've all got lives going on out there. As long as the dog's all right there.
Yeah, he's all right. Yeah. Thank you. So users, and then defining some processes here, if they are a little bit more complex. So definitely using those. It's help clarifying in some requirements. Entity diagrams. So those are the typical ones that, as I said, right, typical business analysis diagram, but quite important also to help you envision the solution. This is the one I strongly recommend using. I will spend a bit of time describing such a diagram, of how building such a diagram, and why is it important, and how that helps kind of building a shared understanding of the vision. Yeah, so that's the one, right? So the conceptual diagram, where essentially I use, and I compare it often to, when you have a house and And before building a house, you almost want to have kind of a draft, a blueprint of that house. And I compare, for example, here, the living room, which is the main room where everything is kind of connected to. If we compare it, for example, to a student management system in Dynamics 365, that could be that student here in the middle piece, right? And everything is connected to that student, right? So it's almost using such diagram to bring your audience, to bring your users with you through that journey. And that diagram is an evolving piece, right? So during each workshops, I kind of present that diagram and I say, okay, during the workshop of today, I'm going to cover opportunities, right? And I show in Dynamics the opportunity management, the process, how quoting words, offer, and I get a lot of feedback. And then during the next workshop, I fine tune my diagram and then I show it again to the audience to show first that I've listened to them and listen to the feedback they provided. And then also, again, it's building that shared understanding of first what needs to be, what the requirements, what needs to be implemented, but also what is that future vision of that system, right? So that was really the conceptual diagram. When to use it, as I said, before each workshop or before each showcase, I show the conceptual diagram. It's pretty much a diagram that I use all the time. And it's, again, a living diagram that I update all the time. Steps to create one. I mean, for those, I really start with a very simple one. That's kind of a simple one, this one. But then, so you start almost drafting those on a whiteboard. I sometimes use a whiteboard to kind of drafting the first, blocks. And then after each workshop, I kind of prettify it a little bit. I use PowerPoint or a tool called Draw to that you can share, and I will show you the next slides about Draw, that I can share online with your users to kind of make it look a little bit prettier, right? So that's really important for me during my envisioning sessions. And that's the diagram I was talking about, a little bit more pretty, a little bit more defined. So if you start maybe from something very simple like that, even most of the time I start with something even simpler than this and then arrive to something a little bit more defined, where this is a diagram that you build together with your client, right? So you present the first one to your client, this one, and then essentially they will tell you, oh, doing on opportunity, I don't want to have the offer here, I want to have something else. Or, what about where do you manage activities on opportunity, right? And then essentially during your next diagram, your next version of the diagram, you bring that in and you define that with the client, right? You kind of show that to the client. And then, of course, my session is pretty much around diagrammings and kind of envisioning. But there is a lot of, I'm share a lot of Dynamics 365 screens and forms as well. Right. Let me show you, that's really the last piece here. Let me show you how I run most of the time. Those diagrams. So that's a diagram created in Draw. And for instance, what I do when I present during a showcase, I start describing the building blocks, right? So I say, look, that is Dynamics 365, and the feature of Dynamics 365 are covering searching and reporting, right? You can use quick find, you can use advanced find, you have some dashboarding and charts, report, and so on. So before even demoing the solution, I show such a diagram to them to make them understand what I'm going to demo to them, right? What are the main features of the platform, right? So this is really Dynamics 365 for customer service. It's one of the app available within Dynamics 365, so it's fairly limited. It has already plenty of features, but it's only the customer service features described here. And then I describe what is an account, which is a company, and I describe what is a contact, which is a physical person, right? And how they are related to each other. And then next step, I show that in Dynamics and how this, how the screens looks one to each other. Then I kind of drill down and go to a little bit more details, right? I can use some layering here, and I go, look, for each of the accounts and contacts, we have activities defined, right? So you can register activities like appointment, phone calls, tasks, emails for accounts and contacts. And you can also register or save documents, notes, SharePoint documents, OneNote, and so forth, right? So everything can be registered, can be saved in Dynamics. Queues management, customer service, connected customer service and cases. For a customer service application, this is key, right? Queues are your shared mailboxes where emails are coming through or some items are coming to for someone to pick, and they can convert that into a case, right? With a process, with SLAs, entitlement, and so forth. There's quite a lot of details here, right? But then again, I show that on a diagram, and then I show it in Dynamics, and so that they understand the features first, and then they see how that works in Dynamics. Another one, I'll kind of show you everything now just to cover, and then knowledge articles. So knowledge articles working pretty much with cases, because you can link knowledge article to cases, and you can straight away send knowledge articles to clients by email when working on a case. Customer service management, all the features that you can kind of tweak within the customer service app, right? So you can tweak automatic record creation for cases. You can tweak parent child cases settings, right? You can schedule some holidays there, right? Also covering, for instance, customization. I can customize design and forms. I can customize, knowledge articles and so forth. Add some timers, add some fields, right? So you kind of explain again to the client, and that's a diagram that you explain, and then hopefully, or you kind of during the session want to get feedback from your clients, so that you can kind of go for the next one with some tweaks, right? The clients will tell you, oh, for account, where are alerts, right? How can I have that I open the account and have alerts? Okay, next time I'll come in and I'll add an alert box here, because and I can show that in Dynamics how that looks like, right? Last one is the user interface, for instance, on such a diagram, right? I describe all the user interfaces possible for Dynamics 365. Yeah, and I think that was one of the last slide. I'll run to the Q&A in a sec. Just to close, that is just some snippets of the tools I use during my envisioning. But again, all those diagrams helps me, or help us all on the project, getting to a same understanding of the requirement and same understanding of the solution we're building. Open for questions if there are any.
That's great. Thank you so much, Dani. Really great presentation, and I can tell you shared a lot of you've been through the walls before now, right? So I'm going to open the floor for questions.
Yeah.
And see if anyone's got any questions.
Yeah.
I'm going to put Ryan back on mute because I don't think he has a question. He was just making noise. Unless you do have some questions, Ryan. You have a very loud washing machine or something in the background. Okay.
Can I use my mic? You can use your mic, I think.
Yeah, sorry, I muted you because you were being noisy. Let me unmute you. Okay, go for it.
Yeah, please do. Sorry about that. I wasn't noticed. I wasn't aware. But yeah, thank you. Yeah, just could you hear me, Dani?
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Just a very quick question. I really like the way you draw your diagrams. I would like to know if there's a tool that you could recommend to draw diagrams like that.
Yeah. So I use most of the time PowerPoint. And then when it's a little bit more complex, like the last one, I use Draw, which is a free tool.
Yeah, okay.
And the advantage of Draw is that you can publish it. There is a publish button, and then you get a nice URL. Like this is a URL, right? This is the URL that is given to you, and then accessible by anyone. If you share that URL, it's accessible by anyone. And then you can add some nice little links, right? So I have a link, for example, to the documentation about those. So if I click on this will open essentially, the documentation of Dynamics, right? So that's the tool I would recommend.
Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries.
Thanks for your question, Ryan. So just to follow up, Dani, the tool that you asked about, you mentioned, it's called Draw, right? D-R-A-W.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Yeah.
We've also got a question from Faraz. He said, how do you recommend to capture the processes?
Yeah, so the business processes, you mean?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm guessing,
Look, the business, again, that's a diagramming too, right? Where if you have, look, I kind of used a lot of business processes capturing before. Over time now, I don't know what happened. Either the processes were defined most of the time with my latest clients, where they had their processes defined, so they were sharing those diagrams with me already, so I didn't really have to capture them. If there is nothing, which is it's tend to be rare now, I think, where clients or customers don't have any processes defined. But if there is nothing specific, then yeah, Draw is a good tool. Visio, those are good tools as well. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Once more, if there is any more questions, Farah says thank you. If there's no questions, then I'm going to ask one because you've still got a few minutes, and then I'll be quiet.
Yeah.
So I want to ask a question that I come across this problem a lot. When you start prototyping in a trial in Dynamics, how far do you go with that? And does it just get to the point where you're like, bloody hell, I've nearly just built the whole system. Why don't I just use this? Like, how do you know where to draw the line? Any advice?
Yeah. Look, you want a prototype for two reasons, right? So when I prototype in a sandbox, I prototype to show screens, so quickly change labels, quickly move forms around, to show that to the client. But then I prototype as well for my own purpose to make sure that solution works. But I go very dirty in it. I know from the beginning I go very dirty, right? So I will, for example, always use workflows, right? Which we should use flow now, but I know workflow are super fast, right? So I know I can quickly use workflows to kind of mimic something for the client, right? Or if that solution needs to work, then I will go to, to flow and kind of just prototype the minimum to make sure it's working. So from the beginning, I know that will be an environment that I will throw away. If you go into that with that mindset that you spit an instance and a sandbox and you just go dirty on it because you don't want to spend time, purifying it. It's just to kind of get some feedback from you, because that's what you want. You want to get as much feedback from them as quickly as possible so that when you start building, you are almost on the right track and you don't take a wrong path on your real environment that will cost rework and so forth, right? So yeah, does that respond to your question?
Going with the intention of throwing it away. I think that's a really good advice.
Yeah. And also remember design thinking. So what I use design thinking in a way is because design thinking has some good values where the essential value of design thinking is your first prototype is to throw away. Your first prototype that you do is to get as much feedback and as much understanding from what needs to be done, but it is something I'll just throw away because I know from that prototype, the more I can make mistakes, the more I learn for my second prototype or real my build, right? So that's why the envisioning that I mostly run now are done just before the project, so that at least we have kind of a shared understanding of what we want to build, and then we run the first sprint where we build stuff, but we continue prototyping in a sandbox environment there, but at least we have the basic right, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. That's great. Thank you, Dani. I do have one more question.
Yeah, sure.
From Shirley, and she says, oh God, now they're all coming in. What are your top three? I'm going to say she did have 3 tips, but I'm going to go for 1 tip. So what's your top tip to clarify unclear requirements or super complex requirements or processes?
Yeah. So Shirley and I have been on a lot of projects together. So yeah, look, a lot of diagramming, a lot of screen sharing, a lot of sharing visuals, right? Look, I'm not a native English speaker, so it's maybe that's why I tend to go to diagramming and sharing screen as much as possible. But I know most people are very visuals, right? So you have difficult requirements. Show how you understand that requirement to someone by simplifying it, right? And kind of challenge and judge whether they will go for it or not. Because you want to make, indeed, you want to try to simplify that requirement. Yeah, sorry.
Okay,
Amy,
I have one more question. Do you have time, or do you want me to like link you guys
maybe
up and let
last
you guys
one. I'll
follow
have to
on?
go to the other one because
Yeah,
I'm monitoring and helping the
sure.
other presenter. So maybe last one, and then I will
So yeah,
switch.
last question from Neeraj. He's asking about when you've got customer projects where they're time bound and fixed price.
Yeah.
How can you introduce this? Is there a smaller but imperative model for such situations?
Each project is different, right? Each project is really different. You need to understand first how complex it is, how many users, how many processes they want to map out. So there is no fit to it. And again, what I said, some clients are well prepared. You will go at some clients and then they will have their vision defined. They will have their requirements nicely listed. They will have a couple of good diagrams for you to understand. And then that envisioning will be super small. It's maybe just clarifying this, right? And you go to other clients where it's way more chaotic, where people don't understand between each other what something means, and then you have to have very long ones. Yeah, sorry, there is no kind of ready to go approach for that.
Like, so let's just say if it was simple, it wouldn't be a project, right?
Yeah, and if you would put simple, they would do it by themselves, right, as well.
Awesome. Right, you need to go and save the world elsewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Dani. Great presentation.
Thank you, Amy, for helping me.
My absolute pleasure. I'm going to stop the recording.
Thank you. Bye, all.